us today is Wally Drangmeister, Director of Communications for New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. And Wally, where is the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association headquartered?
We are headquartered in Santa Fe, New Mexico, just south of the capital.
Oh, okay. And but I bet you travel around quite a bit around the state, I would imagine. In fact, let's learn a little bit more about you here. If I go to the next slide, tell me a little bit about Wally, what you do with NMOGA, and a little bit about NMOGA, would you?
You bet. I've been with NMOGA about 2.5 years. I am what I like to call the best communication director NMOGA has ever had, in that I'm the only one. One of the issues that the oil and gas industries face is ongoing need to communicate with ever broader constituencies, particularly the general public, on what's going on. There's a whole lot of bad information out there, scare tactics and the like, and one of my jobs is to communicate with the media and others about really what the industry does, what our operating practices are, and what the benefits we bring to the state of New Mexico and the communities in which we operate.
Okay. Wally, while I phrase the next question to you, I want you to turn your volume up just a little bit for me. But as you're doing that, what I think I heard you say is that there may be a spectrum of truth in what people in the general public hear about the industry, with one side of one end, bookend, if you will, of the spectrum being people who are anti-carbon energy, anti-oil and gas, anti maybe energy except for renewables, and maybe not even pro-renewables. And on the other side, we may have advocates for industry, which I think NMOGA is. Is that a fair representation of how you see the spectrum?
Yeah, we certainly represent the industry, and we are advocates in the sense that we are supportive of the industry, but also our stock and trade, our tools that we use are basically the facts, science and the like. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there that we continually counteract. One of the big issues that we talk about on a regular basis is the practice of hydraulic fracturing, something that's been used in New Mexico safely for more than 60 years, tens and tens of thousands of wells treated with hydraulic fracturing, and yet that is considered an evil, just frighteningly dangerous practice by certain other sides of the issue, and so we talk about things like that quite a lot.
We're gonna get into fracturing because that's something that we do talk about in the class, and I want people to be aware of and check out for themselves, and we're going to look at that. NMOGA stands for what?
NMOGA stands for New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. So we've been around for a long time. We are having our 85th, I believe it is. I need to double check on the website. I should know that off the top of my head, but we're having our I believe it's our 85th annual conference here coming up. So we've been around a long time representing this industry in the state of New Mexico.
So are oil and gas producers then primarily your membership?
Yes. The producers of oil and gas in New Mexico, the producers that account for over 95% of the production in New Mexico are our members. So all of the large producers in the state are our members, and many, many of the smaller ones. We don't have every producer. There's several hundreds of producers in the state, but we have the vast majority of them are members of our organization.
So you as a communications director are working with the media and general public. I suspect you have a lobbyist that works with informing and educating legislative members. Is that true as well?
Yes, that's true as well. And then one of the other things the association is very active in is on the regulatory side, whether it be the Oil Conservation Division, the various federal agencies, Bureau of Land Management, which is very important in New Mexico because of our extensive operations on public lands. So we host and facilitate large numbers of kind of regulatory committees that deal with the issues in these various regulatory bodies that impact the industry on a daily basis.
So if I were to follow that along, and Wally, as you may know, I actually served as a facilitator between the Bureau of Land Management and Oil and Gas here in Farmington, and actually was partly funded by NMOGA for that exercise, you work together with your membership to reach some common agreement as a policy position to speak with one voice. Is that something you guys work toward doing?
No, that's a very accurate representation. And like all things involving human beings, we don't agree 100% of the time on everything, but we have a very good record within the industry of being able to come to common agreement and common position on the very big issues that are facing the industry on a daily basis.
I can appreciate, Wally, before we hop into our slides, with more specifics of why that might be good for industry. Why might that be good for regulators and the formation of public policy if the industry were speaking with one voice on some of these big issues? What would that mean in terms of timely decision making or having facts out on the table or other things?
No, that's an excellent point, Chris. And whether it's regulators through the regulatory process or even legislators, they very much like it when the industry comes together with a common position. Otherwise, if you view it from their point of view, they could have dozens, if not, hundreds of companies coming at them with slightly different versions of policy matters on the same issue, and that would be very, very cumbersome for them. So it tends to work very well all the way around.
So it speeds the process along and puts into the mix of the public policy discussion 100% or 99 9/10% pure flour if we're baking a cake. Is that a fair statement?
No, that's a fair statement. And in the areas where our members can't come to common agreement on an issue of substance, we're also very forthright in communicating that in terms of that, just whatever the situation is. If there's a couple of different positions, we'll present those. And if there's one where most of the industry is one way, but there's some exceptions, we make sure that the policymakers or the regulators know exactly what the status is. But that, fortunately, is the exception instead of the rule.
Okay. And, I think in a way what I've come to recognize, Wally, is I've heard the NMOGA story, and again, there's a lot of buzz about this word. You guys could be considered in the legislative and policy-making arena to be known as a lobbyist. Is that a fair statement?
Well, we certainly have a lobbyist, and we lobby. We're not shy about that. Good lobbying is just presenting the facts as they are and the impacts to your industry that any given legislation or policy may have. But our effectiveness also comes from the fact that we will present a good balanced view of what those issues are and not just tell one side of the story. First of all, we have opposition on many issues that certainly tell the other side of the story, so it doesn't hurt us to say, now this is what you're going to hear on the other side, and here's why we believe this isn't correct, but these other competing positions are out there. And so again, Wally,
without advocating for NMOGA at the moment, we're going to give you a chance to talk about the industry in detail for the state, just to frame the context. So NMOGA is representing industry. Some names that represent anti-energy development or pro-environment. I'll put that in quote marks because I have reason to believe the energy industry is pro-environment as well. What are some of the forces that you find yourself sometimes in disagreement with?
Well, there's many groups that are out there on the environmental community that basically are against everything we and almost any other energy source does. Having said that, and I think you opened the door, and it's my strong belief, we're very pro-environment, and huge amounts of our activities and efforts and costs are designed to protect the environment. And so there are many organizations out there that have valid concerns that we work with to address, and then there's some other organizations that just basically fan the flames of misinformation and distrust, and they're all there in the mix, and that's, I guess, the both the strength and sometimes one might argue the weakness of a democratic system is that anyone gets to say whatever they want, and then the policymakers have to judge what is truthful and what is factual and what's scientific and what is just scare tactics and hyperbole.
Well, not just policymakers, but how about voters?
No, absolutely. And there's a whole cottage industry out there in terms of sending out scary emails and blog posts and things on the internet. And then they say, help us fight, you know, the evil fill in the blank, whether it's an industry or a company or a type of fuel source. And it's really quite a systematic approach. And so that's what we're dealing with.
So before we move to our next slide, would it be fair and reasonable to, as a voter or a policymaker, before reaching a decision, whether it's in the ballot box or on a piece of legislation, to take into consideration the whole spectrum of information and really work to ascertain what are facts and validate those facts before reaching your decision?
Well, the answer absolutely is yes, but we do realize that there's a difficulty in that. We live in a very technologically complex society, and there's lots of issues, whether it be energy, you know, taxation policy, government fiscal policy, you know, just all the things that happen with communication, telecommunications, the internet, mobile devices. You know, voters are inundated with lots and lots of issues, but we would really like them to have at least some awareness and understanding of what energy issues are and how vitally important it is to them for their day-to-day lives and their well-being as citizens of our country.
So before making that decision as a legislator or a voter, at least know what your facts are and have done some homework and verify you know, what's leading you to your conclusions. Would that be a wise approach in your view?
I would certainly recommend that, and you know, just again, not to beat the drum too strong on hydraulic fracturing, but across the United States, it's been done over 1 million times, and the record is exceptionally good. If this was nearly as bad as some of our opponents say, there would be a lot more evidence out there after having done this for decades, over 1 million times.
Okay. So now let's shift gears. You and I have talked about some general discussion topics that I feel will be of value to the class. Looking at the New Mexico-centric side of things, over time there may be students in this class and program that are not from New Mexico, but I think a lot of the generalities that we'll talk about here, Wally, will apply whether it's North Dakota or West Texas or wherever. What factors, in your view, do oil and gas companies generally consider when making investments in exploration and production? Clearly, they've got a lot of choices of where and what commodity, what fields within a particular state or jurisdiction. From NMOGA's perspective, how do you guys think your members go about making some of those decisions?
Yeah, it's not magical, particularly from a finance point of view. We're trying to make investment decisions that are going to return acceptable rates of return. And so everything that goes into that, whether both on the capital expenditure side and then the expected revenue side and the operating cost side, go into that formula. But the real answer in analyzing any industry, and particularly this one, is to take a look at each one of those components and what are some of the things that are absolutely critical to that. On the capital side, almost all oil and gas companies don't operate on land that they own outright. They lease the rights to explore and produce resources if they're there. And so what is the cost of leasing land? What is the royalty rate if oil and gas is produced? If you're dealing with the federal government, there's a fixed 1/8 of the 0.125% royalty rate. On private land, you can negotiate with the mineral right owner. It can be whatever you negotiate, and so that's a huge piece.
Well, let's stop right there just to help me understand what you're saying. You're saying then that the oil and gas exploration company will have the same price structure for a federal lease, whether it's North Dakota or San Juan County, New Mexico, but the state rate may vary, and a private rate, the state rate may not be negotiable, but it could vary state to state. And on top of that, if it's a private lease, that could be negotiated, and so that's certainly a big cost in terms of producing a mineral. If we got a really high price that a state might be putting on extracting its minerals, your member may or may not choose to invest. Well, where are they going to go? Are they going to go the high price or the low price?
Well, you know, and it's one of those, we're going to go to where the value is. And so a low lease rate with no minerals in the ground is not a bargain, whereas something that might seem like a high rate may be. And then the other thing that impacts that, even though like the federal ongoing lease rate's the same, there's a bonus payment that's made initially where companies come in and bid for the right to start that activity, and that's done on a bid basis. And so a company could bid on a tract of land going into it. They could bid more money than another. And so all of that's going to be based on what they expect is in the area. And that has a lot to do with what minerals. Is it oil or natural gas? Is it a developed basin like the San Juan Basin and the Permian Basin, the two big basins in New Mexico? Or is it somewhere like the Las Vegas Basin out in the middle of the state, which is called a frontier area, that there may be resources that are commercially recoverable, but the activity's not gotten to the point where that's actually happened?
And so these bonus payments plus the actual federal royalty are ways that all of us as citizens of the United States are effectively compensated for the severing of our minerals. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, on the federal side and then on the state side. And in New Mexico, what happens, the lease payments that go to the federal government, those are split between the federal government and the state. And currently 48% of those lease payments that are received by the federal government are then transferred to the state. And so, okay. So the state even benefits not only indirectly through, you know, revenues going to the federal government, but they get a direct piece. So that's a relatively significant amount of money coming into the state of New Mexico. The most recent fiscal year, somewhere around $1 million is my recollection of what that federal amount was. $1 billion is what that was coming through those leases to the state of New Mexico.
Okay. So there's a lot of factors that go into the companies making a decision. If they were to consider New Mexico as a place because they have reason to believe there is oil and gas, certainly you've mentioned two proved production areas, the San Juan Basin and the Permian Basin. What, from your perspective, is kind of the industry spokesperson, if you will, what are some of New Mexico's strengths and weaknesses as a place relative to other places, both in North America and I suppose for that matter abroad, for oil and gas companies to make, why would they want to make an investment here, or why wouldn't they? What are some of our strengths and weaknesses?
Well, the first strength and weakness we need to talk about is commodity price, and that's significant in New Mexico because most of the production in the San Juan Basin is natural gas. And the price of natural gas is, from a recent historical perspective, exceedingly low. And so it wasn't that many years ago where there'd be 50, 60 drilling rigs operating in the San Juan Basin back when natural gas was $8 a 1,000 cubic feet. Well, now there's 4 or 5 rigs operating up in the San Juan Basin, and they're mostly looking for either high liquids natural gas or oil. Meanwhile, in the Permian Basin, oil's up, as we talk, above $100 a barrel. There are many, many, many rigs operating down in the Permian Basin because that's the basin of the state that has proven oil reserves, and that's where the oil is, and so that's where the activity is right now. But if you look at over a long-term basis or a long-term basis, you know, anytime you hear that something can never go up any further or never go down any further, you can pretty much rest assured that that is going to be inaccurate. So, you know, I certainly can't tell you how long it will take for natural gas prices to recover, but I'm highly confident that they will at some point. And I think we will see oscillations both upward and probably downward in the price of oil. So that's
okay. So our first thing to take into account is the commodity price. What other sorts of strengths and weaknesses for a company to make an investment in New Mexico come to mind?
Well, the two existing basins have extremely good infrastructure. Now, it doesn't mean that it's perfect, and in the case of the Permian Basin where there's a lot of growth, they're having to add additional infrastructure. But if you consider developing oil and gas in New Mexico in our existing basins compared to going to somewhere where there's no infrastructure, particularly on the natural gas side, you know, you need a series of gathering pipelines, you need natural gas processing facilities, you need access to interstate pipelines if you're not close by to get that gas to market. And so those are all strengths that we have in both of our existing operating basins. So compared to looking at a frontier area anywhere around the world or around the country, that's an incredible strength that we have here is strong infrastructure, also well understood geology. Now, when I say well understood, it doesn't mean perfect. There's always surprises in these geologic formations, and over time it tends to be to the positive. The industry has an incredible track record and history of every time it looks like one or the other of our basins is going to hit hard times and be on a permanent skid, there will be some more technology in terms of exploration, development, or drilling or whatever that bring more resources to bear. So you never want to count either the San Juan or the Permian out for many, many decades to come.
Okay. So we've got some strengths, which are, as a state, two different commodities, one right now being low in price, unfortunately, for those of us in the San Juan Basin, another being high, oil for the Permian Basin. And we've got some great infrastructure to get our commodities to market. Natural gas, I know, in San Juan Basin is easily transportable to California, for example. I assume oil in the Permian Basin can make it to a number of different refineries. Any other strengths come to mind, or and the geology? What about the weaknesses for the state? Let's switch over to weaknesses. What kinds of weaknesses do we have as a state? It can't be commodity prices. It can't be infrastructure. Maybe it's, I don't know, is it policy or potential policies, or what else could be on the weakness side?
Well, we talked a little bit about different types of land on which oil and gas is developed, and one of the issues that the industry is facing right now is that about over 60% of natural gas and right around 50% of oil is produced on Bureau of Land Management land, and the bureaucracy, the wheels of bureaucracy in terms of permitting, and sometimes the regulations are a little more onerous, a little more difficult to deal with, and so that is a definite, I would call it a disadvantage compared to places like let's look in southeast New Mexico. If you're developing on federal land in New Mexico compared to fee or private land in Texas, the process to get your APDs, your applications for permit to drill, tend to go much quicker on private land, and because most of Texas is private land and much of New Mexico is public, that slows us down. And as you know, time is money, and if you're in the process, it takes weeks or months longer to get permits to go. You can't have your facilities out there, as we say, spinning the bits, drilling the wells. That's one of the big considerations. And then there's an additional set of proposed hydraulic fracturing regulations above and beyond what the state has done. The state rules are very effective, and yet there's a proposal out there, and so we're not quite sure what that might mean, but that gives you a flavor of one of the disadvantages is that there's some great land great geology to develop in New Mexico, but to the extent it's federal land, sometimes the speed and the bureaucracy and the administration's been much more difficult.
So our higher proportion of federal land, and knowing a little bit about North Dakota and the oil boom and the Bakken shale there, most of that's private land as well. So things do seem to move faster. So if I think about the Permian Basin and I think about an area around Jal down in the extreme southeast corner of the state, if I had a decision to drill a well on a federal acreage outside of Jal or move 5 miles down the road to private fee land in Texas, I may actually move my drill rig to Texas, I think is what I heard you say. Is that true?
You know, and not to sound too much like the proverbial economist, all things being equal, the answer is yes. You know, luckily for New Mexico, all things aren't equal, meaning that there's some benefits to the geology, there's some existing operations, there's some other things. But when you're considering two projects, without a doubt, you would give some positive dollars to the fact that a project that was developed on fee or private land compared to federal, no question about it.
Okay. One other question I wanted to touch on in terms of weakness before we move to our next issue on the slide deck here, Wally. Is there the potential or fear amongst the industry that areas of known resource potential being closed off just unilaterally for development? I'm thinking about at a county level or a city level where there's just a unilateral decision to deny the industry access to mineral rights.
Well, that really is a good lead into the third question, and the answer is it's not a fear, it's a reality. When you look at what's gone on over time, federal lands that have been designated as national monuments are off limits to oil and gas production, and so it's happened at the federal level. There are a lot of prohibitions on lots and lots of different types of land from lots of jurisdictions, and as you alluded to, there's a lot more activity at the county and local level in terms of either attempting to, or in some cases at least initially, being able to stifle development of the industry. Places like Santa Fe County, where oil and gas is not prohibited, but their ordinance regarding oil and gas development is so onerous that, you know, I would, you know, this is a wild speculation, but I would think natural gas prices would have to be 10 times higher than they are now for somebody to try to wade into the waters of, say, Santa Fe County as far as developing oil and gas. So that's a huge, huge concern.
Has there been a county that has just outright prohibited development of oil and gas resources?
Yeah, Mora County in northeast New Mexico has the distinction of being the first county to out-and-out ban all oil and gas exploration activities. There are places that have land use ordinances and other sorts of provisions that deal with hydraulic fracturing, but Mora County has out-and-out outlawed it, and so we're going to see as things unfold. There's lots of people looking at that, whether they have the right to do that. It's possible that sort of issue may end up in a court of law at some point in time. But yeah, we have that issue right now, and we know at some point people at least had an inkling that there may be economically recoverable oil and gas resources because there were those lease bonus payments that were issued or that were made on, as I understand it, some state tracts of land. Now there's not, you know, any development going on up there, but there certainly could be at some point. And you know, if what's happening above ground, meaning the politics, makes it illegal to drill holes, you certainly cannot produce oil and gas. And so that's access to land and reasonable rules on which to do that. That's one of the huge concerns that we're working on every day in the industry.
Okay. And Wally, on that same topic, for the benefit of our students, I'd like to explore just for a moment the public policy that has been a well-established policy of mineral right ownership and eminent domain and confiscation. Am I correct in understanding that mineral rights are a defined legal property right in the same way a surface right is?
Yeah, yes, they are, and that's called split estate, and it's big in New Mexico because much of the state and federal lands have a split estate, and a lot of lands that were homesteaded under some of the later homestead acts in the United States, you could acquire the surface rights under those homesteading acts, and these were, you know, many years ago, turn of the last century range, but you didn't get the mineral rights. So you have the right to a section for your ranch or your farm or whatever, but the federal government maintained, and in some cases later on the state maintained the mineral rights, meaning the right to benefit from any extraction of oil or gas or other minerals from the land.
So thinking about Moore County for just a moment, regardless of who owns the mineral right, there is such a thing. It could be the federal government, which is you and I and everyone else as taxpayers. It could be the residents of the state of New Mexico, also as taxpayers. It potentially could even be a private individual, but a county jurisdiction made a policy or law, if you will, effectively, on their own that said that class of owners, whether it's the taxpayers in the federal or state level or individuals, are not able to access their property. It's like someone on the surface building a fence that prevented you from driving over to your road or over a road to your property. Is that kind of a fair analogy?
You know, it's that I believe the legal term is confiscation without just compensation. You know, it's a property right issue, and there's no question these mineral rights are property rights. And, you know, there's legislation and regulation designed to allow the surface owners and the mineral owners to work together. There's a thing in New Mexico called the Surface Owner Protection Act that calls for any surface disturbance to be compensated by the mineral producer in terms of rental of land for the drilling pad, and then, you know, requires restoration once it's done, so on and so forth. But if
you mean the industry doesn't just go in and bulldoze down a road and put a big bunch of junky, noisy, leaky equipment on a pad and walk away and not worry about the surface owner?
No, we certainly don't. And it's like a lot of things in the world. This industry's been around for a long time, and I don't think there's an industry that operates in 2013 that uses the same operating practices that they did in 1940 or 1950. I think we've come a long way. But absolutely, protecting the surface owner rights, taking care of the land, protecting the environment, those are all the jobs of the oil and gas industry, and it's amazing the amount of emphasis and resources that are put towards that end.
Well, we've got regulators that make sure that happens as well, don't we?
Well, there certainly are regulations, and I think regulations are good. They provide the guide in terms of what you should do. And they're very important, but also it's very important that we have companies that do everything they can to honor not only the letter but the spirit of those in terms of implementing those in a way that's actually effective. And we are fortunate to have both of those in this state.
Cool. One other public policy factor that at least I know we've talked about in class that I'd like for you to speak to is this notion of fracturing. We've talked in class in general terms about what fracturing is. We haven't talked about something called the pit rule, and we haven't really talked about what future concerns the industry may legitimately have with public policy regarding fracturing. Obviously, the industry is having to deal with information out there that may or may not be accurate, or movies like Gasland or others. What is NMOGA's view on the New Mexico policies related to pits, and make sure you share with us what pits are, but also fracturing and where you see maybe and hope maybe the future of regulation might go in that area of public policy?
Well, let me start with hydraulic fracturing. You know, it's a well-regulated process. There's many safeguards that are built into the process. The integrity and design of well bores, where we have multiple layers of casing and then cemented into place, and so you'll have cement casing, sometimes 4 deep, but almost always 2 deep. That protects groundwater, and also the area in which hydraulic fracturing fluids are entering the geology tend to be a mile or more below the groundwater zone, so there's a huge spatial difference between the two. And so as things go forward, one of the things that is happening on a daily basis in the industry is that they're looking at better and better ways of doing hydraulic fracturing. In the San Juan Basin, we do a lot of hydraulic fracturing that uses much less water than in other places because the formations can be hydraulically fractured using large amounts of nitrogen. And so that's a way to, for example, use less water. There's some developments in Canada now to use natural gas liquids instead of water. And so in a state like New Mexico, that's one of the things that even use of water, even though we own the water, we buy it from permitted and regulated sources, we're doing whatever we can to use less water as we go forward because, you know, there's an energy information annual energy report that comes out, and in the year 2040, this report, and again, done by the federal government every year, I don't always agree with every conclusion down to the most minute detail, but I would say it's a fair presentation. It has 80% of energy sourcing coming from fossil fuels in the year 2040. So that's not, you know, renewables are important, they're a piece of the mix, but they're not going to get us there as an industrialized society anytime in the foreseeable future, certainly not within my lifetime.
So fracturing is something that has been done a long time. It's a process that occurs well below the surface or the groundwater tables that people get their water from wells. All that I ever see, though, is the one piece of film footage of somebody taking a big lighter to their faucet. Is that something that happens in New Mexico, or is likely to happen in New Mexico, or what is that all about?
I got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is it's absolutely likely to happen in parts of New Mexico. That's the bad news. The good news is it's not related to hydraulic fracturing or production of oil and gas. It is very possible to have naturally occurring methane, which is the key constituent, which we call natural gas, that is contained in wells of certain formations. So if you drill your well into a formation that has a high degree of naturally occurring methane, you can absolutely light your faucets on fire. And there are places in New Mexico where you can do that. You know, there are places all over the country that are called burning springs, for example, because there were naturally occurring springs that contain methane, and you could light them. And, you know, that was like the trick if you're on a camping trip and you knew where burning springs were. If it wasn't lit on fire, you could go impress your friends by lighting it. That absolutely does exist.
Okay. The industry obviously is concerned about additional fracking regulations, and I'm sure surface disturbance. We've heard a lot here, at least in San Juan County, about something called the pit rule. What was that all about? And then as we think about policy going forward, Wally, looking at the last little piece of this question, what happens if policy is developed that is particularly unfavorable or onerous toward the industry?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the pit rule, and that's basically a rule came in a previous Oil Conservation Commission rule that, for all practical purposes, didn't allow the industry to use lined, and I emphasize the word line, production pits or drilling reserve pits. When you drill an oil or gas well, you use drilling mud, bentonite clay, and water to bring the rock to the surface. And in earlier times, you were allowed to dispose these cuttings in a lined pit. And the thing about it is the bentonite clay is a relatively benign source, and as long as the components of the drilling, the rock weren't of a nature that would be harmful in the environment, it was not a big deal. And because there's liquid there, we would have a lined pit to contain that. Until recently,
hold on a second, Wally. When you say lined pit, you mean this stuff just didn't run down the arroyo or the wash?
No, absolutely. And, you know, it's one of those things, not everything's perfectly. Occasionally there's leaks or small spills, and there's rules on how we remediate those and deal with those. But, no, absolutely not. They're, even under the existing rule, before it was called Rule 50, there was requirements for line pits. And so when we were doing drilling, we would put these drilling cuttings in these line pits that were lined with various forms of plastics and other, you know, other engineered materials to contain that material while we were using it. You know, and being New Mexico, it would tend to dry out. The water would be recycled from those pits back into the drilling process.
Okay. So we're paying attention to any changes in pit rules. Are there, let's assume for sake of discussion that some very onerous regulations were implemented statewide. What do you think would happen with your members in terms of their investment in the state?
Well, you know, it's interesting. It doesn't make you quit producing the wells you have necessarily, but you know, anything that happens, it's back to the earlier revenue and cost and capital. If something's going to raise your cost of capital expenditure or going to raise your operating cost, that's another, either one of those things are inputs into your investment analysis methodology, whatever that is. And so if those are things that raise costs above other jurisdictions, then that is likely to reduce the amount of investment that you have in your state, or you know, in this case in our state compared to others. The pit rule that required these things called closed loop systems, early on there's some statistics that I saw that the Texas side of the Permian Basin, right after that regulation went into effect several years ago, they received a much higher rate of investment than the New Mexico side. So there's data that shows, and you know, believe me, it's in lots of other places too, that when you put very costly regulations, particularly ones that don't do anything to protect the environment or safety, those are strongly taken into account when investment decisions are made where you're going to drill your next well.
And of course, those wells generate income for years to come for the state treasury, as you shared earlier. Wally, thanks for some good perspective on the state. I want to shift gears to our last question here, and that is, you know, it seems to me, and you and I have known each other a long time now. This is a very interesting field and line of work that you're in, and you've got obviously some colleagues that work governmental affairs, and probably some people that are in publications and other sorts of departments within NMOGA. But if someone were interested in joining an association that's an advocate for the industry, what kinds of advice would you have to offer to a student in terms of coursework, experience set, et cetera? Because it is an interesting field, and I know you're very, very happy doing what you're doing these days.
Yeah, I love doing what I'm doing, and I came at this a little bit through a indirect route, to say the least. Early in my career, I was a certified public accountant. Now I'm a communication director, and those are not normally put, you know, hand in glove with each other. But one thing I would say, if you're interested in working in any sort of trade association or advocacy work, lobbyist, regulatory affairs person, is gain a technical skill of some kind would be actually my first recommendation. And it doesn't, you know, I would say I think people are better off having a business degree or an engineering degree, or even get, you know, God forbid, I'm not recommending this, and apologies to any lawyers out there, a law degree, but having some background in one of the harder business disciplines And then from there, I believe that if you're interested in this, you can certainly acquire through on-the-job training and projects you work on, the kind of interpersonal skills and the communication skills that you need to do things like that. So that would be my advice. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't be say a political science major or a communications major and do what I do. You absolutely certainly could, but my advice, and I see a lot of people that I think are very effective and very successful, bring to that a little bit different perspective in terms of one of the harder business or engineering or science disciplines.
Well, and speaking of those harder skill sets, I just want to touch base with you just for a moment on this, because this course obviously plays to that. How important is it for someone in your line of work to have a pretty good grip on Microsoft Excel and how to do some basic analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me give you an example, and you know, it's one of those, I won't say I would have been fired if I couldn't do Excel and some of the analysis skills I do, but man, it helps to make me much, much more effective. The dune sagebrush lizard is an endangered species, and I had a data set regarding the number of tracts of land and how many wells were on that. And we were getting questions from members in the media with regard to percentages of existing production that come from tracts that might have this endangered species on it. And so we're trying to figure out what might it do to state revenues and production in the state if the species were listed. Well, there was, you know, let's see, tens of thousands of wells I needed to analyze, and there, you know, could I have done it if I didn't have Excel skills and to do some comparisons and some kind of database summaries? Maybe, but it would have taken me, you know, weeks or months. As it was, you know, it was still a pretty big project, but in a couple of days I came up with some unique information because I was the only one that had done the analysis, and it was very useful in dealing with the media, with our members, dealing with the public about it. And so any of those kind of analysis skills you have, it's amazing. You'll always find a use for them. I'm the rare bird.
You mean facts, numerical facts, and being able to illustrate them and provide them as evidence in a position is important to you.
It's very important. It's one of the things that I think is one of my biggest strengths, and to have the confidence where if I'm challenged to be able to dig into where numbers, whether they're done by me or done by others, to figure out where they came from and get to the bottom of an analysis. That's a huge skill in my line of work, and I would think that would be useful for anybody working for any trade association or any business organization, even if you're on the communication side.
All right, good deal. Well, Wally, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today, and if I wanted to learn more about NMOGA, I'd go to your website, which again is what?
www.nmoga.org. That's NMOGA.org.
All right. Wally, thanks for your time today, and appreciate this. We'll wrap up our recording, and I'll call you back on your house phone in just a minute, okay?
Very good. Great to talk to you, Chris.
Okay.